Imperial Yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through hybridization. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes that complement modern hops. And as a Kvike hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without any negative issues. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. Welcome to the Brew Lab. The American mantra is more is better, which is certainly something that many homebrewers have taken to heart, packing loads of hops throughout the brewing process to increase hop flavor and aroma. But there are challenges associated with adding more hops. I'm your host, Cade, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from the last 2 weeks' episodes, exploring the factors that influence hop creep.
Hop creep is kind of the worst, in my opinion. You know, you go through so much effort to make an incredible hoppy beer, and although there are steps to, mitigate it, and we'll talk about those today, it really can kind of bite you in the butt if you're not careful, and there's nothing worse than a perfect hoppy IPA becoming a buttery mess.
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm drinking a Ninkasi double IPA, which I know has got to have a huge dry hop load because I can taste it in there, and it tastes awesome, right? It tastes nice. There's not a buttery note at all. It's alcoholic. It's a double IPA, sure, but I don't know if it hits spec or anything, but for commercial brewers, this is a real problem, right, that they have to deal with. And a few weeks back, I made a comment that hop creep isn't really an issue for home brewers. I think I still stand by that comment, but we'll see at the end of this episode if I change my mind or not. But even if it's not causing major problems, it's still happening, right? And I think even if you, as a home brewer, even if you think like, okay, I add a dry hop and I don't see any of these issues, like diacetyl or anything, the hop creep is still happening. You're probably just accounting for it some way in your process. So over the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about hop creep a lot. We shared the results from my master's thesis on how terroir and harvest maturity influence hop creep. And then I had an hour-long discussion last week with hop expert and my major advisor, Dr. Tom Shellhammer. And he talked about the lab's almost decade-long research on factors that influence hop creep. So in this episode, Jordan and I will talk about how that research applies to homebrewers, talk about our experiences with homebrewers, and give you some tips and tricks for dealing with a hop creep issue. If you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, come on, why not? If you support us as a patron, you get access to awesome rewards like unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron, of course, is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time, but if you're out there listening to this show and consuming all of the other free content that's available to you through Brülosophy, and you've been thinking, I really should throw them a few bucks a month, yeah, now's the time. The great thing about podcasts is you can pause them and come back later. So please pause the show real quick and head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy. We'll be here when you get back. I love all of our patrons and people who have signed up, and I also love all of our followers at Brülosophy. We've got such an active group of commenters on the website, the YouTube channel, people who email in feedback, people who are on Facebook, folks who share and discuss our results. It's super rewarding and humbling to hear from you all. So I just wanted to say thank you for engaging with us, and I love you. And if you haven't yet left a comment or review of this show or send an email, I'd love to hear from you. My email is cade@brülosophy.com, and of course, you can leave a comment or a review of the show anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And another great way to support us is by using the links at brülosophy.com/support. There's some really cool affiliates who give us a small kickback if you purchase from their site by using one of Brülosophy's links. It doesn't change any part of your shopping experience, but it does help us out. So head over to brülosophy.com/support to check it out. All right, feedback for this week is from Steve. He says, hey guys, on episode 161, Applying the Science Hop Water, you mentioned de-aerating water numerous times. For the most part, it sounded like you assumed it was because of potential oxygen effects, oxidizing on the final product, and that's possible. However, there's another important reason to de-aerate prior to making hop water, seltzer water, sparkling flavored water, or even short and shoddy hard seltzers. And here it is. While air is only slightly soluble in water, 23 milligrams per per liter versus CO2, 3,300 milligrams per liter at 0 degree Fahrenheit, air displaces 50 times its own volume of CO2. So 23 milligrams of air in water will displace 1,150 milligrams of CO2, or 1/3 of your water's capacity to hold CO2. Obviously, this makes it difficult to get the desired carbonation level for hop water, seltzers, etc., even when cranking the CO2 pressure on your keg way up. So ultimately, deaerating is critical to get carb levels right without the need for intense keg pressure and aggressive, quote, balancing of your line length flow rate. Love the show. Thought you might find this interesting. Steve.
Wow, this is incredible. I had never heard of this, and this really is making me think about all those short and shoddy hard seltzers I've made in the past for like parties where it's been really challenging to get the carb level right. And I have not de-aerated or boiled the water for the short and shoddy hard seltzer, which is water, vodka, and like I use organ fruit puree. And wow, this is really enlightening to me, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't actually checked into this in the chemistry, but Steve, I assume this is correct. I mean, you get to put a whole bunch of information into this, and yeah, that's amazing. So deaerating actually allows it to get a higher carbonation, and this made me think about. I have no idea. Again, I'm over my skis a little bit here, but it made me think about all of those huge, heavy beers with lots of alcohol and pastry stouts and all that stuff. Are those actually like doing the same thing? You know, the air in this case is displacing the ability for CO2, but maybe like there's just so much the stuff in those thick, viscous pastry stouts. People are always emailing saying, "Oh, I don't get any carbonation. I've cranked it up to 50 psi on the keg, and I don't get anything. I don't even pour foam. It just pours like flat beer." And I'm wondering, so maybe that's part of it too. Maybe there's more to this displacement of CO2 by other things like air and and viscous solution. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Can you carbonate honey? Can you carbonate molasses? Yeah. Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not. Anyway, cool, Steve. Thanks for that. That's this. It's not often that we get something that both of us go, "Whoa, that's really interesting." But thanks for sending that in, and appreciate you listening to the show. All right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about the freshening power of hops. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
So you've crafted this amazing IPA. You're excited to try it out. It tastes so good when bottling, but you crack the bottle and it's a butter bomb. What happened?
Well, if you're using an ale yeast, it's very possible that this is a function of hop creep. Now, we know that butter is associated with diacetyl, which is actually a fermentation issue, and it's really common in like lagers, right? And it's a function of, I guess, a lot of things, right? That it could be oxidation could be a factor there, but fundamentally it's something that happens during fermentation, and we don't normally associate diacetyl with ales, at the very least American ales, but this darn hop creep thing has kind of made it diacetyl a problem kind of all sorts of styles now.
Yeah, exactly. Diacetyl is kind of what I would consider the major manifestation for homebrewers, right? I think, a lot of homebrewers aren't out there taking daily gravity measurements and trying to hit their target OGs and stuff. I mean, if it's within, 10 or 5 to 10 SG points, most people are like, well, 10 I think would be too much. But if it's within 5, SG points, most homebrewers are kind of like, yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to drink it anyway. But that diacetyl thing is real. And that has happened to me several times where I've had something that I thought was done fermenting. I kegged it up. And then I tap it and I go, oh man, what happened here? This is still super diacetyl-y. Now, it's not the end of the world for you if that is diacetyl there. But I think that's largely a manifestation of hop creep, or certainly not letting your fermentation continue all the way through. So yeah, over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about hop creep. We talked about it first in my master's defense, looking at terroir and maturity. And then of course, last week with Tom, I shared a whole bunch of different factors, and Tom shared a lot of the different research that's gone on in his lab and in other labs. And so, hopefully we've got a pretty good, picture of what hop creep is. But do you think we should spend a couple minutes just kind of like rounding out the chemistry, make sure we're all there?
Sure, why not? Yeah, maybe you can just give us like a really quick explanation of what the hop creep is and maybe like the chemistry behind it.
Yeah. And I think the easiest way to think about it is something that Tom mentioned on the episode. When you're measuring at the end of fermentation, right, you're looking at 1008 FG, right? Or, 2.5 degrees Plato, whatever, right? That 1008, that 08 is residual sugar that's in your beer, right? Residual dextrin. I think that's the easiest way to look at it. When you add hops to beer, enzymes in the hops eat away at that residual dextrin, and it causes it to continue fermentation. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. You're never at remember, 1 on specific gravity would basically be water, and less than 1 would be alcohol, right? So if you have alcohol, that actually reduces your specific gravity. So the easy way to think about this is you have sugars. That's a byproduct of the mash process. It's a byproduct of the chemistry. I'm not going to get into like the details of the different enzymes and all that stuff, the biochemistry that's going on, but there's sugar that's left in the beer that survives all the way through fermentation, long chain sugars that the yeast can't eat. Then you add back all of those enzymes that you loved in the mash, those amylase enzymes and the limit dextrinases and all those things. Those get added back, and suddenly, boom, you have a creep or additional fermentation in the presence of yeast. And that's where, like, exactly what you're talking about, Jordan, that's where that diacetyl can come from. But back in 2018, Jake Kirkendall, who I had way back on episode 8. Ooh, I should have written that down. Anyway, it's called The Freshening Power of Centennial Hops. You should check it out. But he pointed out, hey, there's actually some other cool things that this dry hopping does. If we think about where dry hopping came from 100 years ago, right? Beer was in kegs, right? Or that's how it was shipped around the world. And that's where the IPA came from. Well, at least we think that's where the IPA came from. That's where the claim is. Huge amounts of hops added in the keg made beer that was stable for shipping. And so they often refer to this as like freshening power, right? There's actually something good that's happening here when we add hops. We're getting stability, we're getting antimicrobial, we're getting additional flavor, and we're getting an additional fermentation. So we're getting some carbonation and stuff like that in the keg. As long as we can avoid this diacetyl thing, hop creep isn't a problem.
Right. And I think the big point is that you're accounting for it, right? Because maybe you want another point of attenuation, or maybe you can time it so that you're capturing some of that attenuation or free CO2, as it were. But the big thing is we don't want exploding cans, and we do not want buttery beer. At the very least, I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm curious. I asked Tom this, and I don't know if you've had a chance to think about it, Jordan, but I'm curious. What do you think about this moniker, right? Like freshening power versus hop creep. Everybody calls it hop creep these days, right? Even I call it hop creep these days, as much as I would prefer to call it something else. That it still seems like that's stuck. What do you think about those monikers?
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with the freshening power idea because to me, if your beer tastes like butter, it doesn't taste fresh. And maybe those aren't really synonymous or not, but it doesn't exactly, strike freshness into my mind when I think of a buttery beer.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know you use a lot of hops whenever you're brewing your IPAs, Jordan. We've talked about that a lot. Have you ever experienced hop creep in your brewing?
Yeah, I certainly have, and thanks to a little magical vial that we'll talk about later in the episode, I'm not really having any problems with it anymore. But another trick that we'll talk more about is you just got to really monitor this stuff and make sure, is attenuation really done? And if you're doing that, and especially at the temperatures that I'm conducting my dry hops at, you should be okay.
Yeah. I'm excited to get into that a little bit too, because I think those things are really important. Temperature is a piece of this, and then all that. I'm guessing, by way of teaser, that little vial that you're talking about is alpha acetolactate decarboxylase. Yeah.
Thank goodness for Cellar Science for bringing this stuff to homebrew quantities to us.
Yeah, and that, of course, is the diacetyl reducing enzyme, which we'll get to here in a little bit. But, to Jordan's point, too, right? Like, diacetyl is the probably the biggest manifestation for homebrewers, as I mentioned earlier. But the chemistry is still happening, no matter what, right? Even if you add dry hops, because I can hear a lot of people saying, oh, hey, I add dry hops to my beer, and I've never had this diacetyl problem. Like, what are you talking about? I dry hop all the time, and I don't have dry hop or diacetyl. Yeah, that's possible, but you are having hop creep. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody, or at least I've never seen a attenuation where you added hops and didn't see some residual dextrin, unless you used a specific type of yeast or some enzymes or something like that in the front. So before we get there, what do you do about hop creep if you experience it? First thing I thought we should talk about is what different factors influence hop creep. And so, Jordan, one of the key things from my research, and also this is one of the key things that Tom has found over the last 18 years, is that everything varies by variety. There's some really creepy hops out there, and Cascade is one. And I know you're using Cascade all the time.
Actually, I'm not using Cascade all the time. I like the hop, but I've just found a love for kind of more newer varieties, like be it from New Zealand or the Pacific Northwest. So maybe that's one of the reasons I'm not having too many problems with hop creep, is that Cascade just doesn't really enter my freezer that often.
Yeah. I mean, that's true, right? I mean, if you're using things like Citra, that one doesn't creep as much. Simcoe creeps a little bit. Mosaic also creeps a decent amount, but not a huge amount. But yeah, there's all this sort of variety. And unfortunately, there's not like one place where you can look and see like, hey, does this have hop creep, right? Or like how much is this hop going to creep? And that's something that we've been talking about, is like, how do you get this on a COA, or can you even get this on a COA? Is this something that you can put in the hops? Like, yeah, this is how much this is going to creep if you use it as a dry hop. And part of that's challenging because it depends on the beer you make, but we do know that at least making a consistent beer, if you changed your hop variety or bill, right? Like if you change the amount of hops that you're using or the varieties, you probably are going to see differences in hop creep. So from a homebrew perspective, if you're changing out your varieties, you may want to pay attention. If you changed out your variety of hop and then you experience diacetyl, hey, it may not be a fermentation problem that you have. It might be the hop variety itself that's causing that issue.
Right, and as you learned in your research, it's just not even as simple as just mosaic, right? Like lot to lot, year to year, there's so much variety within a given variety that it's really hard to pin down, it seems.
Yeah, it's really hard to pin down, and I think that's one of the challenges of hop creep, especially for a commercial brewer, but also for a home brewer too. Is a home brewer, you're picking up a package of hops, and you don't have the ability to select the lot or select any of those features that you think are appropriate. You're just going to the homebrew store and buying the pack of Citra, right? Or going to YakimaValleyHops.com and buying a pound of Citra, and they may tell you the lot information, but for the most part, you don't really know. And when you change that lot of Citra to the next IPA, things could be different. So yeah, that's challenging. But there are a couple of other process variables I think that are important to discuss here too. And I talked about these with Tom, but I wanted to spend a little bit more detail here because I think these are things that are directly under the control of homebrewers, and it's time, temperature, and amount, right? Those are three things that Tom and researcher from his lab have shown make an impact on how hop creep goes, and it's important for homebrewers, right? So let's start with time. Hop contact time. That one's a big one because the longer that you let the hops sit at fermentation temperatures or are on the beer before it gets transferred off or over into the keg, those enzymes are still active. And so if the hop is in contact with the beer, those enzymes have more opportunity to interact with the dextrins that are in the beer. If you put it in there for 24 hours or 48 hours and then pull the hops off or pull the beer off of the hops, there's not as much of that vegetal material. So that's one of the things that Vinny at Russian River has talked a lot about, is a lot of the vegetal material is largely where it comes from. So if you're using hop extracts or things like that, there's not going to be as much hop creep. If you're using Spectrum to dry hop, you're not going to see hop creep because that vegetal material is all pulled away. So the longer that vegetal material is in contact with your beer, the worse, and so and it also is, again, a function of dry hop amount too. So if you're using a huge amount of dry hops, and I don't know, we say 10 grams per liter, but that's 6 ounces of dry hops, 6 ounces in a 5-gallon batch, that's a lot of dry hops, and that will actually increase the amount of hop creep that you see. So the hop creep, liberating those fermentable sugars, the yeast use those, but the yeast are still asleep. They haven't woken up yet. And so sometimes they produce diacetyl as a result of that.
So is there a best practice when it comes to hop contact time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, because one of the things too about hop creep, and you heard this in my maturity study, is, if we let hops sit on the vine longer, then we can avoid hop creep, but they turn OG. And so it's the same thing here with hop contact time, right? The longer that we let hops sit longer that we let the hops sit with the beer, there's anecdotes of those vegetal characteristics, the grassy notes that are coming through. Although I will say, I was just having a conversation with Ben Edmonds at Breakside, and he was sharing some of the anecdotes he's heard for some other brewers. And there are commercial brewers out there, some in your neck of the woods, Jordan, that I think you think very highly of, that are doing 7 or 8 days on dry hops. Yeah, and loving the results, which I thought was really interesting. And so one of the things that Ben was saying was, well, okay, here's another reason why I don't want to let our hops sit 7 or 8 days, is because we might see more hop creep by letting them sit that long. But I don't know, maybe the fruity or notes that other brewers are getting from them might outweigh that. So there's kind of a balance. All that is a long-winded way of saying this is a balance. So you need to let the hops be in contact with the beer long enough to get the fruity and aromatic characteristics that you want. But again, the longer that you leave them in there, the more chance you are to have a hop creep issue.
Now, related to time, I would wonder, is if agitation or recirculation, etc., and scale are interactive variables there. Mm-hmm. Do you have any insights there?
Yeah, absolutely. So scale is definitely a variable, right? Because surface area is a big thing. Again, the enzymes only work if they bounce into dextrin, right? They have to have they have to have a site that they can do their job to release those enzymes. So yeah, agitation, if you're mixing things around, more of that hop contact and more of that hop material and more of those enzymes are going to come into contact with the dextrins. And so yeah, you might have some more liberation. I would expect, I don't think I've seen a result or a research paper on this, But I would expect if you're recirculating or agitating or stirring your wort after dry hopping, you're going to see more creep than other people. But that could also be a good thing because that might make things more consistent, right? You might see a consistent amount of creep whenever you do that. And you might be able to reduce your contact times as well, because if you're mixing and agitating and getting all of that hop material and all those hop aromatic compounds into solution, that would be a really nice thing for your beer. But that also kind of plays a role too, is the temperature. I'm curious, Jordan, what temperature are you dry hopping at?
Yeah, I'm dry hopping at room temperature, so somewhere in the realm of like 60 to 70 F, probably not quite 70 Fahrenheit, more like 68, 66 might be a normal maximum for me. And I'm holding it there for a day, and then I'm crashing for another day or maybe 12 hours, and then getting it off the hops. But I'm definitely always making sure that I'm not seeing like higher FGs than when I started, nor is a like quick taste test super buttery.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, when are you typically adding your dry hop? Like what day of fermentation or? Yeah,
at terminal, pretty much. You know, I'm not necessarily like plotting my fermentation curves or taking measurements 6 days in a row to ensure no change, but generally speaking, it's approximately terminal.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Because I think most brewers aren't doing that. Most home brewers, right? You're not taking daily FG measurements. Nobody wants to waste that much beer from a 20-gallon batch or a 20-liter, a 5-gallon batch, right? And so I think that's a really common set of circumstances. You're just kind of monitoring it when you think it's around that fermentation, right? That end, and then you're going to add dry hops. So I think most home brewers are doing something like day 3 or day 5 whenever they're adding it. But for you, that might be terminal. Does that sound about right? Day 3 or day 5, or is it a little bit later before you hit terminal?
I mean, I'm not brewing with Kavik here. It's not 3 days, but
yeah.
So I don't typically start to look at FG until at least day 7. I'm also really having a lot of fun making IPAs with 3470 fermented at about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And it does take longer than Chico variants, even at that higher temperature of 60 F. So I'm looking more like day 7, day 10 or so with these types of fermentations.
Yeah. And then are you seeing a diacetyl increase or a diacetyl spike after that? Or how long are you? So you said you're doing 24 hours on the hops, a crash for 24 or 12 hours, and then you're off and into the keg.
Right. And I'm not seeing it because of this miraculous little vial called ALDC. And I do not dry hop without it. I tend to add it at yeast pitch and then also at dry hop. But there has been the occasion in the last few months that I've forgotten that additional dry hop addition and came out okay on the other side. So maybe that I've heard this little trick that people are adding it. Pro brewers are adding it again with dry hop as extra insurance. Maybe it's not necessary because it's kind of hard to say because there's so many variables at play here.
Yeah, totally. So many variables at play, right? Contact time, temperature, also the amount, but the yeast can play also a role too. So you're adding that ALDC at fermentation start, and that's that ALDC again is the enzyme that turns diacetyl back into acetoin, which is the non-aromatic compound, right? The yeast excretes alpha-ketolactate, and then it turns it straight into diacetyl and straight back into acetoin, which the yeast takes right back up. That's how that enzyme works, which is great. So using that enzyme is cool because you're using that at fermentation, which means you're speeding up that ability for the yeast to take up diacetyl, but then adding it back at the dry hop. That's a really smart idea. And again, like you said, you've gotten lucky a couple of times where you haven't had diacetyl. That also might be a little bit yeast dependent. Some yeast don't seem to throw as much of diacetyl. And there was a recent study by James Bruner, which is interesting because the takeaways from that study were yeast didn't really seem all that different in terms of their ability to like affect hop creep, right? Like didn't matter what yeast you put in, the hop creep was similar across the yeast, but there were a couple of yeasts. And so those, the ones with the stall 1, the diastatic yeast, those ones, they actually ferment out all the dextrins before the hop enzymes can even act on them. So if you're using something like a Saison yeast or something like that, it's going to make a really dry beer in the first place. The other thing is, that like Chico, for example, it does a great job of cleaning up the diacetyls. Not a big deal. But like you said, some of those lager yeasts, especially if you're fermenting at higher temperatures, they are not good at cleaning up that diacetyl. So if you're throwing some hops on top of those, yeah, that can be an issue, which is kind of interesting. So yeast plays a role as well. And I wondered, Jordan, if having 3470, as you're fermenting it, which is not a lager yeast, if I remember correctly, right? It was actually been classified as an ale yeast.
I can't remember, but what is anything real anymore? I don't know.
Is anything really anymore, right? Exactly. But anyway, yeast can play a role too. So that ALDC enzyme is a really cool one. And then of course there's also, amylase enzymes that have been used to make brut IPAs, which we'll talk about here in the next segment. But one of the things too I'm wondering about is you keg all of your ales and IPAs, right? But you do bottle condition some of your beers.
Yeah, I bottle conditioned sour beers and farmhouse beers. And so I've also bottle conditioned dry hopped farmhouse beers. And they've been really enjoyable. And I gotta wonder if that re-fermentation in the bottle could help scrub some, unsavory elements that might be present going into bottling.
Yeah, and of course you're dry hopping before you bottle, right?
Yeah, I would never put a dry hop in a bottle. That sounds like a recipe for an explosion.
Yeah, an explosion and a diacetyl bomb. So don't do that. Luke Chadwick from Bell's Brewery did that and made a whole bunch of diacetyl bombs. But it is interesting because if you leave these enzymes in the beer, they can just keep working forever. I mean, Jake Kirkendall and also Kaylin Kirkpatrick, Tom Shellhammer, they've all shown that these enzymes can work for up to 7 weeks after they've been bottled, right? And you're not filtering, are you?
No.
Yeah. So, all of this stuff can just keep working. So if you're bottle conditioning, be careful because there could be a situation where you might explode some bottles. But all that to say, again, I think all of these things for homebrewers, right? Your variety is going to be an issue, hop contact time, temperature, amount, yeast selection, whether you're bottle conditioning or whether you're not. But you also get away with a lot of things here too, because you can wait until the fermentation is done, and then you may not have to have any of these problems. The other thing is bottle conditioning, like you said, is nice, right? I'm already adding yeast and sugar to it, so maybe that yeast and sugar will take up any of those diacetyl or other things that would have caused a problem if I had put it straight into the keg. So yeah, it's pretty cool to think about.
Right. And so clearly it's not just a simple answer, and there's a lot of different variables at play here. So maybe we can take a little break and then talk a little bit more about how the heck we're actually going to deal with this going forward.
Yeah, that sounds good. We're up on a break, so we'll come back talking about more of the factors that influence hop creep and also how to deal with the hop creep issue if you experience it. More Beer's slogan is absolutely everything for homebrewing, and it's easy to see why, given their selection of over 8,000 products. Like the BrewBuild X3 Uniconical Stainless Steel Fermenter, or the Cosmos series of kegerators that give you everything you need to get started with dispensing and serving your homebrew. For quality fermentations, More Beer carries a variety of yeast and nutrients from the likes of Imperial Yeast, White Labs, and Cellar Science. More Beer offers free shipping on most orders over $59, and they also have a killer YouTube channel featuring brewing tips, hijinks, and awesome gear giveaways. Check out everything More Beer has to offer at morebeer.com.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hey, y'all. Darius Rucker here. A lot of people ask me, what inspires your music? And one of the big things is a strong sense of place. That's why I love my home state of South Carolina and want to share the awesome things it has to offer. From the beautiful mountains down to the sunny coast, it's got it all. Not to mention two of my personal favorites, great golf and amazing food. Come see why I love this place. Visit discoversouthcarolina.com.
People are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. The hiring process can be slow and overwhelming. Simplify hiring with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform With over 350 million global monthly visitors according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. That's Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Terms and conditions apply.
Whether you call it the freshening powers of hops or hop creep, it's happening whether you know it or not. Once we know something is happening and why, the next step, of course, Jordan, is to control it.
That really seems like a good mantra for homebrewing in general, right?
Yeah, right? Yeah. Yeah. We know what it is. Okay, now control it.
Right. And that's the fun part of brewing, right? Is kind of part art, part science. And I think that when it comes to hop creep and dealing with it, I think it's really science. And I don't know how much art there is to adding different enzymes and things like that, but it's important to make a good beer. And, diacetyl, in my opinion, doesn't taste good. And exploding bottles, they don't look good.
No. They definitely don't look good.
And going out of spec for your, TTB, ABV, whatever, that's not good for a pro brewer. And so there's a lot of reasons that we want to control this. But we have some tools, we have some ideas. And so maybe we can talk through them.
Yeah, exactly. And so I spent a little bit of time with Tom talking about this, so I don't want to rehash too much of this, but one of the easiest methods for controlling hop creep is to measure it, right? And again, diacetyl is an easy way to taste this. If you keg your beers or you bottle condition your beers and you taste them and they taste buttery, yeah, maybe hop creep is an issue for you.
Right. So what I do is whenever I'm taking whenever I'm adding a dry hop, I'll take a gravity reading. And I use a tilt hydrometer when the battery's full. I had a problem recently where I tossed it in and I wasn't getting readings since the battery was dead. So, but the tilt's great because you can get a gravity reading without actually getting any beer out. Now, I ferment in kegs, so I'm able to easily get oxygen-free samples by just pushing it out via a party tap or whatever and some CO2. But you want to take a gravity reading when you add your dry hops, and that's when actually it's really good to have a analog reading with a hydrometer because tilt does not act the same when dry hops are in solution. And not to mention, tilt is kind of a proxy. Sometimes you'll take an FG reading with a hydrometer and it's like a couple points in either direction because the tilt might get stuck on some kreuzen or like kind of stuck on the side. So it's good to have an analog reading. So I'll take the analog reading and let's say my fermentation has at this point is 10-10. And I add my dry hops. Lately, I've just been adding them straight into primary and then purging and resealing the vessel. And then 24 hours, I'll take another final gravity reading. And if my standard gravity reading is higher than it was before I added the dry hops, I'm not crashing that beer yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why? I'm curious.
Right. And because it's basically, it comes down to hop creep. It's my fear is that it has added some sort of minor amount of sugar or something via the hops that have not fermented out yet. Given that we know hop creep is a thing, I anticipate that there would be a reduction in gravity to at least to where I started. And I basically am worried about diacetyl. Granted, with ALDC, it's not really as much of a concern anymore, but that's kind of my rule of thumb is that I want my attenuation to at least match, if not exceed, what it was prior to the dry hop addition. To justify going to cold crash.
Yeah, now that's a great topic or a great way for people to look at that, right? If you see an increase, right, in the gravity between the time that before you dry hopped and after you dry hopped, yes, that's right, because hops will add sugar to the wort, and they'll also liberate sugars. So if they've done that and there's more sugar in the wort than there was before the hops, then yes, you're totally about to get a problem with hop creep. So that's a really easy way to look at that, and a good rule of thumb. If your gravity is higher than before you dry hopped, then yeah, you're probably still right in the throes of fermentation. So it's a really good one. The other thing too is a key here, and this is an easy one to do, is you are measuring your attenuation, right? You're measuring where you were before the dry hop addition and where you are after the dry hop addition. But you can also look from the beginning, right? Our OG to FG, right? We've talked about attenuation before. Whatever your original gravity is down to your finishing gravity. And if you're like you, Jordan, where you're dry hopping at terminal, you know what your finishing gravity is. And so you've hit that finishing gravity. Then you can determine, okay, where should I be with the dry hop addition? After you've brewed with it several times, if you've used the recipe or you've done your dry hop addition a few more times, you'll know roughly where you're going to hit, right? 1006, 1007, 1008, somewhere in that range. You know where you're going to hit, and then you can cool it and crash it, and then you'll be safe. But that does require those measurements, and I think that's really important for measuring hop creep at a homebrew scale. Is you have to have something to take those measurements, like hydrometer or tilt or whatever it is that you're using, before you get to that terrible sensory threshold of, oh crap, I've got diacetyl in my beer that I put in a keg.
Right. And so in addition to taking these gravity measurements, I'll also taste the beer. And tasting warm, dry hop laden beer, it doesn't taste the same as like a fresh draft pour, a couple weeks later. So it's kind of hard because I don't know about you, but tasting like straight off the dry hop tank beer, it's pretty intense. Like there's like literally hop pellets that are like floating on your mouth. But if there is a ton of diacetyl present, you're going to be able to taste it, even in this like kind of rough sensory, sample in front of you. And if I'm tasting diacetyl, I'm not crash cooling.
Yeah. The same with me, right? Yeah. If you're tasting diacetyl, whoa. Yeah, definitely don't crash cool. But it's like you said earlier, sometimes you may not even know. You may not be tasting diacetyl yet, but if your if your gravity is higher than it was before the dry hop addition, then okay, that diacetyl's coming. It's coming down the pipeline. Even if you crash it. By the way, that's the thing. Even if you crash it, the yeast and the enzymes are still potentially active at those lower levels, right? Or at those lower temperatures. So you might still see hop creep even at low temperatures, which is kind of interesting to think about. So you might get a diacetyl problem. Even if you taste it, you might get a diacetyl problem down the road after you've kegged it. So it's something that's really important. I love that you're monitoring the attenuation there. Okay, so let's talk about then, how do we deal with a hop creep issue? All right, and I would sort of posit to you, Jordan, and I think you would agree to me, the easiest way to deal with hop creep is to account for it in the recipe design, right? Is to deal with it in the first place. When am I going to add the dry hops? How much am I going to add? How long am I going to let it sit cool? Where am I going to test it? What am I going to look at whenever I get there? But the easiest is just like in the recipe design, plan for a creep.
So I guess the easiest way would be to not dry hop. If we're thinking about recipe, true. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have two thoughts related to recipe design that are kind of like process and ingredient choice beyond what we just talked about, of like just making sure that gravity's finished or, using ALDC. But I think one is spectrum. Right? Or maybe like euphorics and other kind of new modern liquid hop products. I would expect no dry hop creep related to those products. But the other one is like, what about day zero dry hopping? Like, is hop creep really a thing if you're adding your dry hop at yeast pitch?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was an interesting, research that was presented at Minneapolis at the World Brewing Congress a couple of weeks ago. And one of those was, hey, if I add beta amylase at the beginning of fermentation and we just get rid of all those dextrins, hop creep isn't a thing. Diacetyl's not a thing. All of this. It's kind of a novel application that guy Matt Cottrell is doing. And that's kind of the same question, right? Like if I just dry hop at the beginning of fermentation, then the hop creep is just happening during fermentation, right? and so it may be creeping, sure, but it's just during fermentation. So I don't notice, right? Because the beer finishes wherever it finishes and then I'm done. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great thing. So recipe design, like I said, first of all is account for it in the recipe. And like you said, the easiest way is don't dry hop, and then you won't have hop creep. But we're trying to make IPAs, right? So let's kind of assume that we're going to use hop creep going forward. or that we're going to use, that we're going to see hop creep. The second thing, like you said, is timing of hop addition, right? The earlier you put the hops into the fermentation, the less that you're going to see quote unquote hop creep, because the hops or the yeast is doing its thing, right? It's just going to ferment whatever sugar is available. And so again, the earlier that you get those things, that you reduce those dextrins, that's also going to reduce hop creep. So I mentioned the beta amylase. You could actually put beta amylase in the mash. There's exogenous enzymes that you can put in the mash. If you're trying to brew a brute IPA, that's one of the things you want to do, right? Is go into the mash, add some enzymes, and then really, really dry out your beer. And then you won't experience any hop creep because the fermentation has already liberated all the sugars that are possible from dextrin. So, another thing too, change your mash temperature lower your mash temperature, make a more fermentable wort, and then you don't have to deal with hop creep. Now, there's a whole bunch of other issues that come with that, right? You're going to dry out the beer. You're going to have higher alcohol that you're going to have to balance, and all these other things that go into it. But you have a lot of ability to look at this preemptively, and prevent dry hopping from the get-go, right? Which I think is a key here.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when for my IPAs, my West Coast Pilsners, I'm adding fungal alpha amylase to drive attenuation. I might also be using some simple sugars in these recipes as well to further drive attenuation. And I am also using ALDC, which is a huge confounding variable here. But I wonder if that's helping prevent or mitigate diacetyl as a function of hop creep, is my use of this enzyme that really helps with, intentional over attenuation.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting too, because here we talk about hop creep and the things that we're doing to avoid it. But you're using fungal amylase, you're using ALDC, you're also you're putting your hops in at the end of fermentation. You're also looking at the measuring the gravity to see if the gravity increases. So you're actually doing quite a bit to avoid or deal with or mitigate the effects of hop creep.
Totally. And, it's not good in IPA, but it is really bad in a West Coast Pilsner. That is the last thing you want, is any sort of diacetyl in there, because these West Coast Pilsners are super dry and they're super lean. They're only 4.5%, 5%. And the slickness on the mouthfeel that diacetyl creates is just going to wreck any sort of delicate West Coast Pilsner. I think a 8%, IPA, you could hide behind that a little better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like I said, even like a double IPA, right? The Ninkasi double IPA that I'm drinking right now while we're recording the podcast. Yeah, there's a lot to hide behind there. There's a lot of hop addition. There's a lot of alcohol. There's a lot of body, a lot of mouthfeel, a lot to hide behind. But I'm sure that they're doing something else to help with hop creep, because I think, who knows, that diacetyl, even at small amounts, can really get to you. So yeah, but it is kind of like pulling these different levers. Again, from a homebrew perspective, what you're looking at whenever you're dry hopping the beer is, when are you hitting terminal? And that's kind of what you're looking at, is here's when I'm going to add my hops. So one of the things too, I'm surprised at the number of homebrewers that don't have hydrometers out there, that are just kind of like, putting the beer in and letting it go for 2 weeks and just assuming it's going to be done, right? Or adding a dry hop and then 2 days later crashing it, and assuming that you're not going to have hop creep. One of the things I would suggest for homebrewers is get a hydrometer. They're super cheap. They break a lot, and I'm notorious for breaking hydrometers, but get one, and then start measuring. Start taking some measurements at the end of fermentation before you add that dry hop in. I think that's one of the biggest things you can do to mitigate this issue.
And when doing that, make sure that you get a finishing gravity hydrometer if this is what your goal is, because the standard hydrometer, which goes from 1090 to 1.0000 or so, or maybe even like 0.9990 or whatever, the increments are 2, right? So every line represents 2 standard gravity points, or half a Plato. You're not going to be able to read the difference at this level of nuance for the tiny amount of sugar that a dry hop load is going to add, the tiny amount of additional fermentation that you're going to get via hop creep. You really need a finishing gravity hydrometer, which I think is from 1020 to like 0.999 or so, to be able to really accurately measure this in an analog format.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. In an analog format to measure it. But, and I think, again, that is important. Like you mentioned, alcohol and hops do things to digital formats for measuring. Like you said, the tilt hydrometer isn't that accurate with hop additions. I would also suggest that brewing software really doesn't account well for hop creep, right? I've noticed that like whenever I add hop additions into brewing software, my final gravity doesn't change. Right. And I've always kind of chuckled at that because I'm like, okay, I put in the malt and it says, okay, you're going to finish at 1010. And then I measure it and I'm at like 1004. And I'm like, okay, what happened here? And then I realized, I added a bunch of dry hops. And so the most of the brewing software doesn't account for the hop creep potential that you're going to see, in a dry hop. So if you're consistently getting lower finishing gravities than is calculated by your brewing software, that could also be hop creep. So again, back to this like recipe design, understand that if you're adding a dry hop, you're probably going to finish a few points lower than what your target finishing gravity is going to be. And that's important because like Jordan was saying, whenever he sees the spike in finishing gravity, it goes up after dry hopping. If you are intending to hit at 1008 and you're at 1008 before you add dry hops and then you measure it again and you're at 1008, that means there's probably still some fermentation that's about to happen to you, right? There's still some sugar that's being fermented by yeast. So be careful. It should creep a little bit after. You should go down, right? The gravity should go down after you add dry hops. Again, that's a big takeaway, I think, and a very easy way to think about, dry hopping. Now, Jordan kind of offhand mentioned too, in terms of recipe design, use less hops. But again, like you said, spectrum. Those are eliminate hops is what you said. That would be a really easy way to do it, but using fewer hops is good, right? A couple of weeks ago, we talked about dry hop reduction methods. Those will also help reduce hop creep.
Yeah, but who wants to do that? That's no fun.
I know, right? That's not the American way. We can't use fewer hops. Okay, how about we change the hops, right? So instead of using just 100% T90, what if we used Spectrum? And the form of hop actually does matter. So T45 hops actually creep less than T90, and T90 creeps less than whole cone.
Right. So have you guys tested Lupomax or Cryo?
Yes, there was a study that has, not Tom Schellhammer's lab, but there was a study that had tested Cryo, and Cryo did less than T90, right? Cryo was also more consistent across varieties, which was interesting. I thought that was really surprising. I think this is research out of Cal Davis that was showing this, that Cryo hops creeped similarly. Even like Cascade and Mosaic, they didn't have like that huge varietal difference whenever you're looking at Cryo. So yeah, there's something about the cryo process, probably the freezing, right, of it that's eliminating or denaturing a lot of those enzymes. So that sort of makes sense, right?
Great. So we can trade diacetyl from hop creep for hop burn.
Yeah, exactly. Cryo used in the right percentages is great. You've had Stash Cryo. I mean, I know you like those Hop Valley beers as well too, but maybe you don't, but I do. But anyway, yes, the type T90 and whole cone. If you're using whole cone, you can expect to see a lot more hop creep. Again, that vegetal matter is kind of the way I think about this. The percentage of vegetal matter is going to increase the amount of hop creep that we see.
So one thing we haven't talked about is style. And earlier you kind of mentioned something about attenuation might being something that you can help mitigate hop creep. So I am brewing exclusively West Coast style hoppy beers these days, just over the haze craze personally. And a big part of that is I just don't like the mouthfeel in these sweeter beers. And there's a lot of elements going on there, higher finishing gravities, less bitterness, at least from the 60-minute edition realm. And collectively you can make those sweeter or drier or less bitter, etc. But kind of generally speaking, I'm just not a fan of hazies. Even when they try to dial that in a little bit more, like the West Coast hazies, like Cellar Maker, I'm a lot more on board with those. But that's all of that is to say, I'm mashing really low, like 146, 147, 148 Fahrenheit in my dry West Coast hoppy beers. Now, hazy makers, not only are they tending to mash, they sometimes mash higher. Something even like 160 Fahrenheit wouldn't be unheard of. They're resulting in way higher finishing gravities. At where I'm going down to like 1006, so that's what 1.5 Plato. They might be finishing at 1016, 1020. Right, so 14 Plato finishing gravity or something like that, and they have all these wacky ingredients like oats and stuff like that. So, my question for you is any of that relevant to hop creep? And if so, can you kind of like disentangle why hazy methods and ingredients might make more or less hop creep relative to like dry West Coast style?
Yeah, again, so hazy. One of the big things there is to move things earlier into fermentation, right? You're going to do a huge whirlpool addition. You're going to maybe do a biotransformation addition at the start of fermentation. You may not be waiting until the end of fermentation to do your huge dry hop load. So that's one thing that might affect here, right? The other thing too, I think, is you mentioned that mouthfeel is important for a hazy, and so the higher fermentation temperatures are going to result in more residual dextrins that are there. Now, and again, it's important to note that these enzymes are there and present and can make a more fermentable wort, but they're still not going to work on everything, right? There are sizes of dextrin chains that are too big for yeast to ferment that alpha amylase and beta amylase aren't going to work on. For example, maltodextrose. That's a glucose chain of 4 units, right? If you've got a whole bunch of maltodextrose in your beer, I understand that's going to help with mouthfeel. That's going to increase mouthfeel, but the yeast isn't going to ferment that, right? So it's just going to be residual extract that's there. Alpha amylase and beta amylase also won't attach to anything that's that small, and so won't get broken down into units that yeast can ferment. So from a chemistry perspective, you're going to have a lot of these, dextrins that are too small for amylase and beta amylase to act on, but too big for yeast to ferment, which is going to result in a lot of body and a lot of mouthfeel. And so I think, that's part of it, right? So changing that mouthfeel. Also, using things like protein or using things like oats and wheat are going to add a lot of protein. Protein's going to add a lot of mouthfeel. Mouthfeel is going to create foam. All those sorts of things are going to end up changing that mouthfeel of the beer. One thing I think you're asking, and I think you're getting to, is do we still see hop creep in hazies? And the answer is yes. You do still see hop creep. If you're adding a dry hop at or near the end of fermentation, you're going to see hop creep. Shoot, even if you add dry hops at the beginning of fermentation, you're probably still getting a little bit of extra conversion from dextrin into fermentable sugars. The only way you won't see dry hop creep or hop creep is if you're using those enzymes in the mash. If you're adding exogenous enzymes in the mash and eliminating the dextrins from which hop enzymes could act on, that's really the only way you're going to avoid hop creep. The other things are just counting for it in the process, and so I think that's where it's coming from. Like a West Coast IPA has a huge dry hop addition, maybe some whirlpool addition, but the focus isn't whirlpool and no boil and biotransformation and all that. It's bitterness and it's hop aroma, right? And so you're looking for bitterness in the boil. You may do a whirlpool addition. You might do some mid fermentation or early fermentation dry hopping, but your main charge is going to come at the end. And so I think just differences in methods there are causing differences in hop creep.
But at the end of the day, given the preponderance of methods associated with either style, right? Like West Coast IPAs, we tend to match lower. We also might be more likely to add sugar, a simple sugar, because we want to drive that attenuation. Ultimately, the reason we're matching lower, adding sugar, is we want a lower finishing gravity relative to a hazy IPA. And also, like we said, they're adding extra exogenous or not exogenous adjunct ingredients to improve the haze, ostensibly. Collectively, is there any reason that either style would be more prone or less prone to hop creep or hop creep problems as a function of the ingredients and methods associated with the style?
Yeah, I think West Coast IPAs would be a little bit more prone to hop creep than like the hazies would than the East Coast IPAs. And again, I think that's just a function of mainly how it's made, right? Mainly how the the mash is performed, the low, even though you're still doing a low mash, like a 148 Fahrenheit or something like that, you're still going to have some dextrins. You're still adding a huge hop load at the dry hop, and I think hazies, again, well, I would also say too, it depends, of course, right? I mean, it depends on your beer and what you're brewing, because I think you can make a hazy that would have higher hop creep than a West Coast. You could also do which would have lower hop creep, right? You could make those two things. You could make a hazy that has higher hop creep than a West Coast IPA, and vice versa. I think generally on base, your West Coast IPAs are going to have and experience a little bit more hop creep because of the process. You are mashing at a lower temperature, which is going to have a more fermentable wort, but you're still going to have significant dextrin that survives through the beer. When you add that huge dry hop charge at the end or near the end of fermentation, boom, you're going to see some hop creep. It's going to dry out a little bit further.
Yeah, and I also wonder if, at least when it comes to diacetyl, that it would be more noticeable in a West Coast IPA because, again, there's that mouthfeel element of the slickness that diacetyl provides. With a big finishing gravity double, hazy IPA, you might not be as bothered or as noticeable when it comes to the diacetyl effect. Relative to a really lean, dry West Coast IPA, you're going to notice it.
Yeah, and again, I'll second this again. We've talked about it a lot, but that ALDC enzyme, right? For homebrewers, diacetyl is the big thing that you see, right? For a homebrewer, I don't think we really care if we finish at 1008 or 1004, right? Nobody really gives a crap. For a commercial brewer, that's real because that's alcohol that has to get reported on a label that potentially puts you outside of TTB regulations. But for a home brewer, I don't really care, right? If I finish at even 1012 to 1004, I don't know that I would really care all that much about. I'd be like, okay, it finished a little bit lower than I expected it to. But if I get diacetyl in a West Coast IPA or something that I don't want to be have diacetyl in it, that's where it really gets bad for me. And so I think circling back to where we started this episode, where I was saying it's not really, hop creep isn't really a big deal for homebrewers. It can be a big deal for homebrewers, but I think most homebrewers are doing processes and things that are avoiding the bigger impacts of hop creep. Namely, you're doing things to avoid diacetyl. You're letting your fermentation finish all the way out. You're particularly Jordan, are monitoring your fermentation to know when to crash your beer. You're using ALDC, you're using that fungal amylase, that potentially dries out your beer a little bit. So you're doing things to mitigate the effects of hop creep. And I think a lot of other homebrewers are doing that same thing, basically just as a function of time, like letting their beer sit a little bit or consuming the beer, within a month before it has a chance to sit or go onto a shelf or sit in a hot container truck, and heat up and do additional fermentation. So I think homebrewers benefit in a lot of ways where hop creep isn't as big of an issue for a lot of homebrewers as it is for commercial brewers.
One thing that a lot of early, newer homebrewers struggle with is oxygen exposure to their finished beers, and that can be a problem with lagers, that you have these VDKs that hadn't converted until the oxygen was there to catalyze the reaction or whatever. And so a beer that might taste good on kegging day can all of a sudden become a diacetyl bomb by the time you're done lagering because of this oxygen exposure that happened, and then now it's too late. Is that relevant here when it comes to hop creep diacetyl, or is that a totally different issue and they don't really necessarily interact with each other?
I mean, I guess the amount of the precursor that's formed is relevant, right? And so yeast forms that precursor and excretes it out of the cell, where then it gets to interacts with ALDC or whatever else, and then forms diacetyl. So if that precursor is there, if the alpha-acetolactate is there, then diacetyl can form, right? And that's the problem. And so I think in those lagers where they're not allowing fermentation to fully finish, then you get those diacetyl bombs. Same thing with a beer where you crash before the yeast has had an opportunity to take back in that alpha-acetolactate, the diacetyl that's been produced from the alpha-acetolactate decarboxylase. So those areas are where there's some overlap in those two, but I do think they're sort of two different functions, right? One of them is just fermentation not finished, and the other one is adding hops in creates additional fermentation that hasn't finished, if that makes sense.
Well, and even if the hop creep wasn't enough to scare you away, oxygen will ruin a dry hopped beer. So you absolutely do not want any oxygen touching this dry hopped beer, as you learned firsthand.
Yeah, well, and as you learned when I shared those beers with you. But yeah, of course, oxygen is terrible and nefarious, and we don't want that in our beers. And again, that's one of the problems too, I think, with hop loads, and maybe something that is hop creep related, the amount of oxygen that's present in the wort. I wonder how much of that impacts some of these issues, right, that we see with hop creep, because you're exposing, you're opening up the beer that's done with fermentation, adding all these hops in, hopefully not adding a huge amount of oxygen. But I wonder if you are adding oxygen in, maybe that's also causing some of the issues with hop creep. So that's an interesting one to sort of bring up and wrap up. Well, is there anything else there, Jordan, that you wanted to talk about with respect to hop creep, especially as it might relate to homebrewers?
Actually, I have one more question for you that I want to end on. We talked a lot about process, but one thing I'm wondering about is the field, and specifically the kiln. What does that have to do with hop creep? Is there any evidence to suggest that the lower kilning temperatures of late have contributed to increased hop creep?
Totally. So, anecdotally, if you look at the confluence, right, whenever IPA started to become popular, when New England IPA and hazy started to become popular, we also reduced the kilning temperatures that were prevalent. And that reduction of kilning temperatures was supposed to preserve the aroma in hops. But no, one of my colleagues, Lindsay Rubottom, who's now over at Hop Valley in the quality assurance department over there, did a whole bunch of research that looked in kilning temperatures. And yeah, as kilning temperatures are increased, hop creep goes down, which makes sense. You're kind of burning off and denaturing some of those enzymes. And so, yeah, Budweiser, Bud and up at Elk Mountain Farm, they changed their process of kilning based on that research that Lindsay performed, and said that, okay, yeah, now they don't have to worry in some of their craft brands as much about hop creep. Obviously, like Bud Light, and Budweiser and Busch and Michelob and all those other brands aren't using dry hops, so they're not dealing with hop creep anyway. But their craft brands that are having some of those issues with hop creep, and they don't have to worry about it. So yeah, kilning can play a huge role in hop creep, with higher temperatures, reducing the amount of hop creep that you see. That said, I think most growers, especially in Washington and definitely in Oregon, are still kilning at low temperatures. So hop creep is still going to be a thing for the future if you're dry hopping at or near the end of fermentation.
And what about New Zealand or Aussie or UK varieties? Have we learned anything about international variants there?
Yeah, so that's interesting too. I asked a New Zealand hop grower that this last, a couple of weeks ago at the World Brewing Congress, and so they kiln in an entirely different way. I don't want to derail this too far off, but Americans use a deep bed kiln, so they're giant 32-foot by 32-foot kilns with about 2 feet or 2.5 feet of hops in it. Germans and New Zealanders use what they call stacked kilns. So if you can imagine, there's sort of 3 kilns that are on top of each other, and they kind of like the top kiln the bottom kiln opens up, and that's the one that's most exposed to the heat. It opens up and all of those hops dry out, and then the middle one drops down to the bottom one, and the top one drops down to the middle one, and then they fill the top one. So there's sort of like 3 levels of drying that's going on at the same time. But what that does is it actually allows more of the drying to happen. It allows for a more consistent dry as opposed to an American deep bed kiln. So yeah, that drying actually at even a little bit higher temperatures reduces hop creep.
So you're saying that we're seeing less hop creep from New Zealand varieties?
Mm-hmm, correct. Yeah, that's what we should be anticipating. Now, again, this is anecdotal. I don't know that there's a story that there's a paper that's been published on this, but yes, seeing less hop creep based on the kilning process that they're doing. Now, the reason they're doing that is not because of hop creep or because it's necessarily better, but the volume of hops. I mean, Americans are growing, 22,000. I can't remember actually off the top of my head, but Americans are growing huge numbers. I think there's like 70 hop growers in the U.S. and 22,000 acres, where in Germany there's like 1,100 hop growers for 20,000 acres. So less acreage and like 10 times the amount of hop growers. So American hop growers are having to deal with a huge amount of volume And so that's a difficult and a challenge for them as they try to combat these things and provide hops that brewers want. So that's also something to keep in mind. But to answer your question, as a function of the way that the New Zealand and German, European hops are dried, yeah, we see less hop creep in those varieties, or at least we anticipate that we should.
All right, so everyone, you heard it here first. Cade Job is recommending you bake your American hops in your oven or in your air fryer before you add them to the dry hop. Then you won't have any hop creep.
No, that would be interesting. We didn't talk anything about pasteurizing, right? Because you can pasteurize the enzymes. You could potentially boil your bag of hops and pasteurize those enzymes, but I don't know what you're doing to the aroma. So yeah, we'll leave that right there. And no, I am not recommending that you air fry your hops before you put them in your beer, but potentially kilning at higher temperatures could be something that hop growers do to preserve hop creep. All right. Well, anything else, Jordan, before we call it a wrap?
No, I think we did it.
All right. Well, we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode, and we'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit Brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.